Marcus Chen was living the dream. At 42, the tech mogul's name appeared on Forbes lists. His smart home automation company had just gone public for $3.2 billion, and his penthouse overlooking Seattle's skyline was featured in Architectural Digest. His wife Victoria, a former model turned philanthropist, hosted charity galas that raised millions. They had everything money could buy, except one thing they desperately needed. Their 7-year-old son, Daniel, hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. But Marcus Chen didn't know that the answer to his family's greatest struggle was already walking through his front door each evening, pushing a janitor's cart that squeaked on the imported Italian marble floors. He didn't know because he'd never actually looked at her. Watch until the end to see how this incredible story unfolds, and let us know what time you're watching today. The Chen residence occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Cascade Tower, a monument to wealth and innovation. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Puget Sound like a living photograph. Every surface gleamed, the white marble, the chrome fixtures, the glass sculptures that cost more than most people's homes. In the center of this perfection sat Daniel, a small boy with dark hair and enormous brown eyes, surrounded by $80,000 worth of therapeutic equipment that might as well have been invisible for all the good it did him. Daniel Chen had been diagnosed with severe autism at age 4. Before that, he'd been a chattering, joyful toddler who pointed at airplanes and laughed at his father's silly faces. Then, gradually, like a light dimming, the words stopped. The eye contact vanished. He retreated into a world that his parents, despite their vast resources, couldn't reach. Marcus had assembled what he called his A-team, the best pediatric neurologists, developmental specialists, and behavioral therapists money could buy. When Daniel stopped eating anything except plain pasta, they hired a nutritional psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins. When he started banging his head against walls, they brought in a sensory integration specialist from Sweden. Nothing worked. The nannies came next. The first nanny was Bridget, a stern British woman with 30 years of experience in high-profile households. She lasted 6 weeks. Marcus remembered watching through the baby monitor as Daniel screamed, his small body rigid with distress, while Bridget tried to implement a structured schedule she promised would bring order to chaos. Instead, Daniel threw himself against his bedroom door so violently that he left a dent in the mahogany. Bridget gave her notice the next morning. Her professional composure finally cracked. "I've cared for royal children," she said, her voice shaking, "but your son, he doesn't want to be reached." The second nanny, Yuki, came with credentials in applied behavior analysis and a gentle Japanese approach to childhood development. She made it 3 months ago. She created a calm room with soft lights and weighted blankets. She learned Daniel's routines down to the minute: cartoons at 7:15 a.m., cheese crackers at 10:30 a.m., no blue plates ever. Yet Daniel remained locked away, tolerating her presence but never connecting. When she tried to introduce new foods using a reward system, Daniel stopped eating entirely for 4 days. Victoria found Yuki crying in the kitchen at midnight. "He's teaching me, not the other way around," Yuki whispered, "and what he's teaching me is that I'm not enough." They came one after another, these highly trained professionals, each convinced they would be different. Maria from Argentina, who specialized in nonverbal communication, lasted 2 months before admitting defeat. She'd worked with autistic children across South America, but Daniel's walls were different. "It's not that he can't communicate," she told Marcus and Victoria during her exit interview, her eyes troubled. "It's that he won't. There's something, he's protecting himself from something, but I can't figure out what." Catherine, a former pediatric nurse with a master's in special education, made it 5 weeks. She documented everything: Daniel's sleep patterns, his food intake, the exact angle he liked his toys arranged. Her reports were thorough, professional, and ultimately useless. Daniel grew thinner under her watch, his eyes more distant. Priya, recommended by a renowned autism clinic in Boston, tried music therapy. She brought instruments, played soft melodies, and created rhythm games. Daniel covered his ears and rocked in the corner until she left the room. She managed 6 weeks before the stress landed her in the emergency room with panic attacks. By the 3rd month of their search, Chen stopped counting. The parade of nannies blurred together, their hopeful first days, their gradual frustration, their apologetic departures. Each one came with a new theory, a different approach, and a specialized technique. Each one failed. One nanny lasted only 11 days. Another made it 7 weeks, but gained nothing except a collection of bruises from Daniel's meltdowns. The most recent, a woman named Claire, with a PhD in developmental psychology, had seemed promising. She'd published papers on selective mutism and sensory processing disorders. She'd consulted with families worldwide, but after 3 months, even Claire had to admit defeat. "Mr. Chen," she'd said, standing in his home office surrounded by awards and patents, "I think Daniel needs more intensive intervention than a home environment can provide. There are facilities." "No," Marcus's voice had been steel. His son was not going to an institution. They would find someone. They had to. That was when Elena Martinez arrived. Not as a nanny, the Chens had stopped interviewing after Claire left. Elena came as she had for the past 8 months, at 6 o'clock each evening, through the service entrance that the wealthy residents of Cascade Tower never used. She wore a grey uniform with sparkle clean services embroidered on the pocket. She pushed a cart with cleaning supplies and industrial vacuum that hummed as she worked. She was 41 years old, though she looked older, her hands roughened by chemicals, her back slightly bent from years of scrubbing other people's floors. Nobody in the Chen household knew her last name. Victoria called her the cleaning lady when she mentioned her at all. Marcus had literally never spoken to her directly. To them, Elena was part of the building's infrastructure, like the heating system or the security cameras, necessary but invisible. But Elena saw everything. Elena Martinez had cleaned houses since she was 16 years old, starting with her aunt's motel rooms in Tucson, then working her way north over 2 decades. She'd scrubbed toilets in office buildings, polished floors in luxury hotels, dusted chandeliers in mansion after mansion. She'd learned that rich people rarely saw the help, which was fine by her. Invisibility had advantages. You heard things. You saw things. You noticed patterns that the people living in the homes missed because they were too close, too busy, too certain of their own perspective. The Chen penthouse was her last job of the day, 3 evenings a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. She had 2 other clients in the building and 3 more in neighboring towers. It was good work, steady, better than the hotel jobs. The pay covered her rent for the small studio apartment in Renton, sent money to her mother in Tucson, and kept her daughter Sophia in community college. Elena didn't complain about the long hours or the ache in her knees. She'd learned a long time ago that survival meant showing up, staying quiet, and doing the work nobody else wanted to do. But she'd also learned to pay attention. The first time Elena had seen Daniel Chen, 6 months ago, the boy had been sitting in the corner of the living room, carefully arranging toy cars in a precise line. The nanny at the time, Elena couldn't remember which one, had been on her phone, occasionally glancing at Daniel, but mostly scrolling through social media. Daniel's mother had swept through, elegant in designer yoga pants, kissed the air near her son's head without touching him, and disappeared into her suite. Daniel hadn't looked up from his cars. Elena had pushed her cart past, the wheels squeaking slightly, and Daniel's head had snapped up, not toward her, toward the cart. His eyes had tracked the wheels with intense focus, his small hands stilling mid-arrangement. Nobody else had noticed. Over the following weeks, Elena began to see patterns. Daniel didn't like unexpected sounds. The vacuum sent him fleeing to his room, but he was drawn to repetitive noises. The rhythmic squeak of her cart, the hum of the refrigerator, the specific beep of the elevator reaching the 42nd floor. When she cleaned the kitchen, always starting with the counters and moving clockwise around the room, Daniel would sometimes drift closer, not looking at her, but positioning himself where he could observe her routine. The nannies changed, but Elena remained constant. She arrived at 6 o'clock, entered through the service door, worked her way through the rooms in the same order every time. Living room first, dust the sculptures, wipe the glass coffee table, vacuum the rugs. Then the kitchen, counters, sink, appliances, floor. The dining room with its table seated 12 but was never used. The hallways, the bathrooms. She worked around whatever nanny was currently employed, invisible and efficient. And she watched Daniel. Unlike the professionals with their credentials and theories, Elena didn't try to reach Daniel. She simply existed in his space, predictable and quiet. She noticed that he always lined his toys up facing east. She saw that he only drank from cups that were completely full. If the water level was even slightly lower, he wouldn't touch it. She observed that he had a small stuffed elephant, worn and faded, that he carried everywhere but never during mealtimes. The elephant stayed on a specific chair, watching until Daniel finished eating. Then he retrieved it, his small hands gentle. She also noticed things about the nannies. The current one, before Claire arrived, had been a young woman named Ashley who talked constantly, a stream of bright, encouraging chatter that made Daniel shrink into himself. Elena had seen him cover his ears, rock back and forth, his distress obvious, but Ashley kept talking, believing that engagement meant filling every silence. Claire had been better, quieter, but she tried to change Daniel's routines, believing structure needed to be imposed rather than observed. She'd rearranged his toys to encourage flexibility. She'd varied his meal times to reduce rigidity. Daniel had stopped sleeping. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened day by day. Elena had said nothing. It wasn't her place. She was the cleaning lady, not a therapist or a nanny or anyone whose opinion mattered. She pushed her cart, cleaned the floors, and went home to her own life, to Sophia's excitement about her nursing classes, to her own small apartment where dinner was whatever was on sale at grocery outlet. But Elena noticed something no one else saw. She noticed that Daniel's distress was worsening not despite the professional help, but because of it. And she noticed something else, something that made her hands still mid-wipe of the kitchen counter one Wednesday evening in late October. She noticed that Daniel's worst episodes always happened after the evening medication routine. Claire, the nanny with the PhD, had a system for Daniel's medications. 3 pills, carefully measured doses prescribed by his neurologist, 1 for anxiety, 1 to help with sleep, 1 to reduce repetitive behaviors. Claire administered them at 7 o'clock each evening, crushing the pills into applesauce because Daniel couldn't swallow tablets. Elena had been cleaning the kitchen, the first time she really paid attention to this routine. Claire had prepared the applesauce in a small blue bowl, crushing the pills with professional efficiency. "Come on, Daniel," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm. "Medicine time. Then you can watch your show." Daniel had eaten the applesauce obediently, his face blank. 30 minutes later, Elena had heard him crying in his room, not the explosive meltdown cries she'd heard before, but something worse. A broken, hopeless sobbing that made her chest hurt. She'd paused outside his door, mop in hand, listening. Inside, Claire was trying to comfort him, confusion in her voice. "What's wrong, sweetie? Are you not feeling well? Does something hurt?" Daniel couldn't answer, lost in whatever private anguish had seized him. Elena had moved on, finished the floors, packed her cart, but the sound of that crying followed her home. The next week, she paid closer attention. Daniel took his medicine at 7. By 7:30, his hands were shaking. By 8, he was in his room, crying or banging his head against his pillow. This happened every evening she worked, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, like clockwork. On a Monday in early November, Elena was wiping down the bathroom counters when she heard Victoria Chen's voice, sharp with frustration. "Claire, we are paying you a fortune. Why is he getting worse, not better?" "I don't know, Mrs. Chen." Claire sounded exhausted. "His behavior is actually more regulated during the day. It's the evenings when, then fix the evenings. That's what we hired you for. God knows we've tried everything else." Elena squeezed out her cleaning cloth, water dripping into the sink, and said nothing. It wasn't her place. These people had doctors, specialists, and experts. Who was she to question them? She was a woman who cleaned floors. Her own daughter was the first person in their family to go to college. Elena had barely finished high school, pregnant at 17, married at 18 to a man who left before Sophia's second birthday. What did she know about medicine or autism or helping children? But she knew what she saw. And what she saw was a little boy who was fine as he ever was, until 7 p.m. each evening. 3 days later, on a Wednesday that felt like it carried the weight of winter, despite the calendar still reading November, Elena arrived at the Chen penthouse to find chaos. Victoria was on the phone, pacing the living room in expensive athleisure, her voice strained. "I don't care if she's booked solid. Tell her it's an emergency. Tell her we'll pay double her consultation fee." Marcus was home early, a rarity. He stood in the hallway outside Daniel's room, his face grey with stress, still wearing his suit from work. Through the crack in the door, Elena could hear Daniel's screams, raw, animal sounds of pure distress. Claire emerged from the room, her professional composure finally shattered completely. Tears streaked her face. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice breaking. "I've tried everything. He needs more help than I can give him, more help than anyone can give him at home." "We're not institutionalizing our son," Marcus said, his voice dangerous and quiet. "Then I don't know what to tell you." Claire's hands shook as she pushed past him, heading for the guest room where she kept her things. "I have a master's degree and 15 years of experience, and I can't help your child." Maybe no one can." Elena heard this from the kitchen, where she'd been frozen, holding a bottle of granite cleaner, her heart pounding. She should leave. This was a private family crisis. She should slip out the service entrance, come back another day. Instead, she set down the cleaner and walked quietly toward Daniel's room. The door was ajar. Inside, Daniel sat on his bed, his small body rigid, his hands pressed over his ears. He was making a low, keening sound, rocking back and forth. His stuffed elephant had fallen to the floor. His eyes were squeezed shut. Elena looked back down the hallway. Victoria had disappeared into her suite, still on the phone. Marcus had followed Claire, his voice rising. No one was watching the boy. Slowly, Elena pushed the door open wider. She didn't enter the room. Some instinct told her that would be wrong, an invasion of Daniel's space. Instead, she stood in the doorway and did something she'd done 1,000 times before in her work. She began to hum. It was an old song, something her own mother had hummed when Elena was small and scared. No words, just a melody, simple, repetitive, predictable. The same 4 notes, over and over, steady as a heartbeat. Daniel's rocking slowed, just slightly, his keenness quieted to whimpers. Elena kept humming, standing completely still in the doorway, making herself as predictable as her cleaning cart, as routine as the sunrise. Slowly, incrementally, Daniel's hands lowered from his ears. His eyes opened, not to look at her, but to look at the space in front of him. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to deepen. Elena hummed for 5 minutes, 10. Her legs ached from standing still, but she didn't move. She'd learned patience in hotel rooms and office buildings, in the long hours of repetitive work that rich people paid her to do so they didn't have to. Finally, Daniel lay down on his bed, curled on his side. His eyes remained open, but the tension had left his body. The crisis had passed. Elena stopped humming. She bent slowly, picked up the fallen elephant, and placed it on the bed next to Daniel, not touching him, just close enough that he could reach it. Then she backed out of the room, quiet as a shadow, and returned to her cart. Her hands shook as she picked up the granite cleaner. Behind her, she heard Victoria's heels clicking on the marble. "Oh, he's calmed down. Thank God." Claire must have finally figured something out. Elena said nothing. She sprayed cleaner on the counter and began to wipe in small, circular motions. But that night, lying in her small bed in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling while traffic hummed on the street below, Elena Martinez couldn't stop thinking about Daniel Chen. About his medicine routine, about his evening deterioration, about the way he'd responded to something as simple as a predictable sound. She thought about the parade of professionals who'd tried and failed to reach him. And she thought about something Sophia had mentioned last month, something from her nursing classes, about medication interactions, about how children metabolize drugs differently than adults, about how sometimes the treatment could be worse than the condition. Elena wasn't a nurse. She wasn't a doctor. She was a cleaning lady who hadn't even finished high school, but she knew what she'd seen. And the next morning, for the first time in 8 months of working in the Chen household, Elena did something she'd never done before. She asked to speak to Mrs. Chen. Victoria Chen stood in her pristine kitchen, a green smoothie in one hand and her phone in the other, staring at Elena Martinez like she'd just materialized from thin air. It took her a moment to even register who had spoken. The cleaning woman. What was her name again? I'm sorry, what? Victoria set down her smoothie, confusion wrinkling her perfectly maintained forehead. Elena held her cleaning supplies, her fingers tight around the handle of her caddy. She'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times during her bus ride this morning. But now, standing in front of this woman who wore more money on her wrist than Elena earned in 6 months, the words felt impossible. I wanted to talk to you about Daniel, Elena said, forcing her voice to remain steady. About his medicine. Victoria's confusion shifted to something colder. His medication is prescribed by one of the best pediatric neurologists in the country. It's really not, she paused, her expression making clear exactly what she thought. It's not something you need to worry about. The dismissal was polite but absolute. Victoria's attention had already returned to her phone, scrolling through messages, the conversation over before it had begun. Elena stood there for another moment, heat rising in her face, part embarrassment, part something sharper. Then she nodded, silent, and pushed her cart toward the living room. What had she expected? That Victoria Chen would listen to the help, that her observation that Daniel seemed worse after his medicine would matter coming from someone who scrubbed toilets. She should have known better, should have stayed invisible, stayed in her lane. These people had resources Elena couldn't imagine. If something was wrong with Daniel's medication, his expensive doctors would figure it out, except they hadn't, not in the 3 years since Daniel had stopped talking. Claire gave her notice that Friday. Elena arrived at 6 to find her packing, her face drawn with exhaustion and failure. Victoria was already interviewing replacements, her assistant handling the preliminary screening calls. Marcus had stopped coming home early, easier perhaps to stay at the office than face his unreachable son. The weekend nanny, a tired woman named Bate who worked Saturday and Sunday, managed Daniel's basic needs but nothing more. She administered his medications without question, following the schedule left by Claire. Saturday evening, Elena heard through Sophia that the Chen family's weekend had involved another emergency, another call to the neurologist, another sleepless night for everyone. By Monday, Victoria had hired the 11th nanny. Her name was Jessica, a 26-year-old with a bachelor's in psychology and a cheerful confidence that set Elena's teeth on edge. Jessica arrived with new strategies, new theories, new enthusiasm. She created charts. She implemented reward systems. She talked to Daniel constantly, filling his space with commentary and questions he couldn't answer. Elena cleaned around them, invisible as always, and watched Daniel retreat further into himself. But she also watched something else now, something she'd noticed but never really tracked before. She watched Jessica with the medication. It was Wednesday evening, Elena's second shift since Jessica had started. Daniel had been having a relatively calm day. Jessica had mentioned this to Victoria, pleased with herself. He'd eaten lunch without resistance. He'd allowed Jessica to read him a book, even if he never looked at the pictures. Small victories. At 7 o'clock, Jessica prepared the medication routine exactly as Claire had done before her. 3 pills, crushed into applesauce, blue bowl, small spoon. Elena was wiping down the dining room table, close enough to observe but not so close as to seem intrusive. She watched Jessica open the medication bottles, 3 orange prescription containers lined up on the counter. She watched her tap pills into her palm, crushing them with a pill crusher, but something caught Elena's attention. A hesitation in Jessica's movements, the way she glanced toward the hallway before adding the pills to the applesauce, the way her hand moved to a 4th bottle, one that had been sitting beside the prescriptions but wasn't labeled with a pharmacy sticker. It was subtle. If Elena hadn't been watching specifically, she would have missed it. Jessica crushed something from the fourth bottle into the applesauce, stirred quickly, and carried the bowl to Daniel. "Medicine time, buddy." Jessica's voice was bright, cheerful. Daniel ate the applesauce, his face blank and obedient. Elena's hands had stopped moving on the table. Her heart beat faster. What had that fourth bottle been? A supplement, maybe? Something the Chens had asked Jessica to add? Or something else? She finished wiping the table, her movements automatic, her mind racing. She was imagining things. She had to be. Jessica was a professional. She'd passed background checks. She'd been hired by people who could afford the best screening processes money could buy. But Elena had cleaned houses for 25 years, and she'd developed instincts about people. About the small tells that revealed the character. The way someone treated animals, or spoke to service workers, or acted when they thought no one was watching. And something about Jessica made her uncomfortable. 30 minutes after taking his medicine, Daniel began to cry. Not the full meltdown that had been happening recently, but a soft, broken whimpering that was somehow worse. Jessica tried to comfort him, confusion evident in her voice. "What's wrong, sweetie? Are you tired? Does your tummy hurt?" Elena packed her cart slowly, delaying her departure. She moved through the penthouse, putting away cleaning supplies, straightening things that didn't need straightening. She was still there when Marcus came home at 8:30, his face tight with stress. "How was he today?" Marcus asked Jessica, his voice weary with the weight of asking this question every single day and never getting the answer he wanted. "Really good, actually, much better. He ate well, seemed calmer. It's just the evenings that are hard." Jessica gave him an encouraging smile. "I think we're making progress. Sometimes things get worse before they get better, right?" Marcus nodded, wanting to believe her, desperate to believe anyone who offered hope. Elena slipped out through the service entrance, troubled and uncertain. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at her phone, finally opening Google and typing with 2 fingers. Can medication make autism worse? Medication side effects, children, medication interactions, anxiety, autism. The search results overwhelmed her. Medical journals she couldn't fully understand, parent forums full of conflicting experiences, warnings about rare reactions and contraindications. She was out of her depth, drowning in information that required expertise she didn't have. She clicked on one more link, signs of medication overdose, children. The list made her stomach clench. Drowsiness, confusion, emotional instability, difficulty sleeping, increased agitation, all things Daniel experienced every evening, but that didn't mean anything, did it? His doctors had prescribed these medications. They knew what they were doing. And even if there was a problem, what was she supposed to do about it? She'd already tried talking to Victoria and been dismissed. Elena set down her phone and closed her eyes, trying to sleep. But the image of Jessica's hand reaching for that fourth bottle kept playing in her mind. On Friday, Elena arrived at the Chen penthouse with a plan. Not a sophisticated plan, she wasn't equipped for sophisticated things. But a simple one: pay attention. Document what she saw, trust her instincts. If she was wrong, no harm done. She would continue cleaning, continue being invisible, and Daniel would eventually find whatever help he needed from the experts his parents could afford. But if she was right, Elena pushed the thought away and focused on her work. Living room first, as always. Dust the sculptures, wipe the glass, vacuum the rugs. Jessica was in the playroom with Daniel, implementing some new therapeutic activity involving colored blocks. Daniel sat motionless while Jessica arranged and rearranged the blocks, explaining patterns he showed no interest in learning. Elena moved to the kitchen, her eyes cataloging everything. The medication bottles sat on the counter. She'd noticed they lived there now, easily accessible for the evening routine. 3 orange prescription bottles with pharmacy labels. And beside them, partially hidden behind the coffee maker, a 4th bottle, small, dark glass, no label. Elena wiped down the counters, working her way closer to the bottles. Her heart hammered. This was insane. She was being paranoid. She should leave this alone. But she thought of Daniel's crying, of his deterioration. On the way he'd responded to her humming that one night, showing that underneath the walls, there was still a child who could be reached. When Jessica's voice floated from the playroom, "Good job, Daniel, you looked at the blocks," Elena made a decision. She pulled out her phone, a cheap Android that Sophia had convinced her to buy last year. She'd barely learned how to use the camera, but she managed to open it now, her hands shaking slightly. She photographed the medication bottles, all 4 of them, arranged on the counter. The 3 prescription labels were clearly visible. She made sure of that. The 4th bottle was angled so she could see it had no label at all. Then she put her phone away, her pulse racing, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure. What was she doing? If anyone saw her taking photos of the Chen's medication, she'd be fired instantly, maybe arrested. Rich people didn't like the help snooping, didn't like them documenting anything, but she'd done it. The photos were there, timestamps and all. Elena finished the kitchen and moved on, routine and predictable, invisible Elena who cleaned and said nothing and caused no trouble. At 7 o'clock, she was in the guest bathroom scrubbing grout that didn't really need scrubbing when she heard Jessica in the kitchen preparing the medications. Elena emerged from the bathroom, cart in hand, moving through the hallway at the exact moment that would place her passing the kitchen. She saw Jessica crush the 3 prescription pills, saw her add them to applesauce, and saw her reach for the 4th bottle, glance toward the doorway, not seeing Elena, who stood just outside her line of sight, and add several drops of liquid to the mixture. Stirring quickly, efficient, practiced, Elena kept walking, her squeaky cart announcing her presence, giving Jessica time to finish. By the time Elena entered the kitchen to empty the trash, Jessica was already carrying the bowl toward the playroom, calling out, "Medicine time, Daniel." Elena lifted the trash bag from the bin under the sink, her mind screaming. She'd seen it, really seen it. Whatever was in that 4th bottle, it wasn't prescribed medication. It wasn't something the doctors knew about. She tied the trash bag, carried it to her cart. Should she say something right now? Confront Jessica. Tell Victoria, and say what? That she'd seen the nanny add something to Daniel's medication. Something that might be a supplement, or a natural remedy, or something perfectly innocent that the parents had approved. She had no proof that what Jessica was doing was harmful, no evidence beyond her own suspicion. Elena finished her shift, packed her cart, and left through the service entrance. But this time, instead of going straight to her car, she sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes, staring at the photos on her phone. 3 prescription bottles, 1 unlabeled bottle. She opened her text messages and typed a message to Sophia. "Can you ask someone in your nursing program a question for me about medications?" Sophia responded within minutes. "Sure, Mama, what's up?" Elena stared at her phone, trying to figure out how to ask this without revealing too much, without sounding crazy. Finally, she typed, "If someone was giving a child medicine for autism and anxiety, could adding something else make them worse? Like another medication?" 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Definitely. Drug interactions are serious, especially with kids." "Why?" Elena didn't answer. She started her car, a 12-year-old Toyota with a rattling exhaust, and drove home through Friday evening traffic, her mind churning. That weekend, while she cleaned office buildings and a lawyer's condo, Elena couldn't stop thinking about it. She researched on her phone during breaks, squinting at medical websites. She learned that benzodiazepines, one of Daniel's medications, could have dangerous interactions with other drugs. She learned that children metabolized medications differently than adults. She learned that medication overdose could cause exactly the symptoms Daniel displayed every evening. But she also learned that these were common medications, prescribed to thousands of children, usually safely. The problem wasn't the medication itself. The problem was the 4th bottle, the unlabeled addition that Jessica was giving Daniel without anyone's knowledge. Or was it without anyone's knowledge? Maybe Victoria had asked Jessica to add a supplement. Maybe Marcus had approved it. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation that Elena was too ignorant to understand. On Monday evening, Elena arrived at the Chen penthouse determined to let it go. She would do her job. She would stay in her lane. These weren't her people, and this wasn't her business. But when she walked into the kitchen, she saw Victoria standing at the counter, staring at Daniel's medication bottles with a frown. "Jessica," Victoria called out. "Why are there 4 bottles here? Daniel only takes 3 medications." Elena's breath caught. She paused in the hallway, listening. Jessica emerged from the playroom, her expression smooth and unconcerned. "Oh, that's just a natural sleep supplement, melatonin. I mentioned it to Mr. Chen last week. He said it might help with Daniel's evening routine. It's completely safe. You can buy it at any drugstore." "He mentioned it to me too," Victoria said slowly. "But I thought we decided not to add anything else until we talked to Dr. Morrison." "Did we?" Jessica's smile was apologetic, charming. "I'm so sorry. I must have misunderstood. I thought you'd both approved it. But it's harmless, really, just a gentle sleep aid. I can stop giving it if you want." Victoria hesitated, torn between asserting authority and not wanting to seem unreasonable. "Well, if it's just melatonin, has it been helping?" "I think so," Jessica said confidently. "He's been sleeping more soundly, haven't you noticed?" This was a lie. Elena knew it was a lie. Daniel had been sleeping worse, waking up crying, having nightmares that left him gasping. But Jessica said it with such assurance that Victoria, who saw her son for perhaps an hour a day, nodded slowly. "Okay," Victoria said. "But let's mention it to Dr. Morrison at his next appointment." "Absolutely," Jessica agreed. Elena pushed her cart past the kitchen, her hands gripping the handle so tightly her knuckles went white. Melatonin. That's what Jessica claimed. But if it was just melatonin, something you could buy at any drugstore, why wasn't it labeled? Why was it in a dark glass bottle with no identification? And more importantly, why had Jessica lied about Marcus approving it? The following Wednesday, Elena arrived at work to find an email from the cleaning service she worked for. A brief professional message. "The Chen family has requested that you arrive at 5:00 p.m. instead of 6:00 p.m. on your scheduled days. Please confirm the receipt." The time change was unusual, but not unheard of. Sometimes clients wanted cleaning done before dinner guests arrived, or before their own schedules shifted. Elena confirmed, adjusted her route, and arrived at the Chen penthouse at 5:00 that evening. Jessica wasn't there yet. She worked until 7:00 p.m., arriving at 8:00 a.m. and leaving after Daniel's evening medication and bedtime routine. A weekend nanny covered the other days. For the first time in the 2 weeks since she'd started watching Jessica, Elena was in the apartment without the nanny present. Just her and Daniel, and Bate, the weekend nanny, who was finishing her shift. "Oh good, you're here early," Bate said, grabbing her purse and jacket. She was a tired woman in her 50s, competent but disconnected, treating this job like the paycheck it was. "He's been fine today. TV is on. I'm heading out, my daughter's got a recital." And then Elena was alone with Daniel. She stood in the entryway, her cart beside her, suddenly uncertain. Daniel was in the living room, visible through the archway, sitting on the floor watching cartoons. His stuffed elephant sat beside him. He didn't acknowledge her arrival, but his posture wasn't distressed, just distant, locked away in his private world. Elena began her normal routine, living room first. She dusted quietly, moving around Daniel with practiced efficiency. He didn't react to her presence, didn't move when she vacuumed, though she noticed he angled his body slightly away from the noise. She moved to the kitchen, and that's when she saw it. The medication bottles, all 4 of them, are sitting on the counter as usual, but Jessica wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours. The evening medication routine wouldn't happen until 7:00 p.m. Elena stood at the sink, wiping down the counter, staring at those bottles. Especially the 4th one, the unlabeled dark glass bottle that Jessica claimed was melatonin. She absolutely should not. This was crossing a line, violating privacy, potentially breaking laws she didn't fully understand. But Daniel had been crying every night, getting worse, not better. And Jessica had lied to Victoria. Elena was certain of it. The smooth confidence with which she'd explained away the 4th bottle, the way she'd claimed Marcus had approved it when Victoria clearly hadn't known about it. Elena looked toward the living room. Daniel remained focused on his cartoons, unaware and unreachable. She picked up the 4th bottle. It was small, maybe 2 ounces, brown glass with a dropper cap. She unscrewed it carefully, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The liquid inside was clear, odorless, could be anything, could be melatonin, exactly as Jessica claimed. Elena pulled out her phone and photographed the bottle, the outside, showing it had no label, and the inside cap where a manufacturer might stamp identification. There, DIPHENDOXYL, small letters, barely visible. She didn't know what that meant, but she photographed it anyway, her hands shaking. Then she screwed the cap back on, placed the bottle exactly where it had been, and stepped back from the counter. What had she just done? If anyone found out, if there were cameras she didn't know about, she would be fired, arrested, ruined. Sophia was counting on her income to stay in school. Their landlord was already asking about renewing the lease at a higher rate. Elena couldn't afford to lose this job over paranoid suspicions. She shoved her phone in her pocket and returned to cleaning, her movements mechanical. Counters, sink, appliances, the same routine she'd performed thousands of times, but her mind raced, trapped between fear and certainty. At 5:45 she heard the front door open. Chen's voice, earlier than usual. "Daniel, where's bait? Cleaning ladies here," came a small voice from the living room, not Daniel, but the TV. Marcus walked into the kitchen, loosening his tie, and nearly ran into Elena. He stopped short, seeing her for perhaps the 3rd time in 8 months of her working in his home. "Oh, you're here early." "Yes, sir." Elena kept her eyes down, respectful, invisible. "The service asked me to change my time." "Right." He barely looked at her, already moving past to the refrigerator. "How's Daniel been?" he was asking her. Elena blinked in surprise. "He seems calm today, sir." "Quiet," Marcus nodded, not really listening, his mind clearly elsewhere. He pulled out a bottle of water, drank half of it standing at the counter. His eyes fell on the medication bottles. He picked up one of the prescription bottles, frowned at the label, set it back down. Elena held her breath. Marcus looked at the 4th bottle. His hand moved toward it, hesitated. "Jessica mentioned adding melatonin," he said, almost to himself. "Victoria wasn't sure, but God knows we need to try something." He sounded so tired, so desperate, so far beyond the end of his resources that even someone like Elena, invisible and insignificant, could see the cracks in his perfectly maintained life. Elena made a decision. "Mr. Chen," her voice came out smaller than she intended. May I ask you something?" He looked at her, really looked at her, probably for the first time ever. Surprise flickered across his face. "What?" "The 4th bottle." "Did you approve of Jessica giving that to Daniel?" Marcus frowned. "What?" "She said it was melatonin, said we discussed it." "Why?" Elena's mouth went dry. "I might be wrong, sir, but I don't think that's melatonin." The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's entire body went still, his executive mind suddenly laser-focused on the cleaning woman in front of him. "What did you say?" Elena wanted to take it back, wanted to apologize, grab her cart, and flee. But she thought of Daniel crying, of his small body rocking in distress, of 3 years of professionals failing to help him, while this new nanny, with her confident smile, added mystery, substances to his medication. "I saw her giving him something from that bottle," Elena said, her voice steady despite her terror. "She told Mrs. Chen it was melatonin, but I looked at it." She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, found the photo, showed him the stamped letters on the cap. "It says something else." Marcus took her phone, stared at the image. His face went white. "DIPHENDOXYL, that's diphenhydramine and doxylamine, that's not melatonin, that's..." He looked up at her, something dangerous in his eyes. "When did you see this?" "I just looked at it today, sir, but I've been watching her give it to him for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, his voice rose. 2 weeks and you're just now saying something?" Elena flinched, but held her ground. "I tried telling Mrs. Chen about the medicine making him worse. She said it wasn't my concern." The words hung between them, an accusation and a truth. Marcus's jaw clenched. He picked up the 4th bottle, stared at it like it was a snake. The front door opened again. Jessica's cheerful voice called out, "Sorry I'm a bit late. Traffic on I-5 was insane." Marcus didn't answer. He stood in the kitchen, holding the bottle, his face a mask of controlled fury. Jessica walked in, saw him, saw Elena, saw the bottle in his hand. Her smile faltered. "Mr. Chen, is everything okay? What is this?" Marcus's voice was deadly quiet. "That's the melatonin supplement I mentioned, for Daniel's sleep. You said—" "I said no such thing." Marcus twisted off the cap, showed her the stamped letters. "And this isn't melatonin. This is diphenhydramine, double dose, based on the concentration. You've been overdosing my son with antihistamines." Jessica's face went through a rapid series of changes, surprise, confusion, then calculation. There must be some mistake. The bottle must be mislabeled. I bought it thinking it was." "You bought an unlabeled bottle from where, exactly?" Marcus cut her off. "And gave it to my child without actually knowing what it was. I was trying to help." Jessica's voice shifted, becoming defensive. "Daniel needed something to help him calm down in the evenings, and the doctors weren't." "Get out." Marcus's words were ice. "Get your things and get out of my home, now." Jessica's facade cracked completely. "You can't just fire me. I have a contract. You drugged my child with mystery substances. I can absolutely fire you. Get out before I call the police." Elena stood frozen by the sink, witnessing the confrontation she'd inadvertently triggered. Jessica's eyes landed on her, and for just a moment, Elena saw pure hatred there. Then Jessica spun and stalked toward the guest room where she kept her belongings. Marcus set down the bottle, pulled out his phone, and dialed. "Dr. Morrison, it's Marcus Chen. I need you to come to my home immediately." "Yes, it's an emergency. It's about Daniel's medication." He hung up, then looked at Elena, really seeing her for perhaps the first time in 8 months. "What's your name?" "Elena, sir." "Elena Martinez." "Elena." He said it slowly, like he was committing it to memory. "Thank you, I thank you." She nodded, uncertain what to say. In the living room, Daniel continued watching cartoons, unaware that his world had just shifted. Dr. Morrison arrived within 40 minutes. A gray-haired woman in her 60s who carried the authority of 3 decades treating children with developmental disorders. She listened to Marcus's explanation, examined the unlabeled bottle, asked precise questions about timing and Daniel's symptoms. Then she asked to speak to Elena. Elena sat in Chen's formal dining room, a room she'd cleaned dozens of times but never imagined sitting in, with Dr. Morrison, Marcus, and Victoria, who had rushed home from her yoga class. Elena's hands twisted in her lap, her cleaning uniform suddenly feeling like a costume in this room full of expensive people. "You said you noticed Daniel's symptoms worsened after his evening medication." Dr. Morrison's voice was kind but clinical. "Yes, ma'am." Elena's voice was quiet. "Every night, about 30 minutes after he took the medicine, he would start crying. Sometimes worse than crying, hitting his head, screaming. It happened like clockwork. And this has been going on for how long? Since I started working here 8 months ago, but it got worse in the last few weeks." Victoria made a small sound of distress. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Elena met her eyes, and for once she didn't look away. "I did, ma'am. You said it wasn't my concern." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Dr. Morrison cleared her throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, I need to be honest with you. The medication regimen Daniel is on is strong, necessary, we believed, given his symptoms. But if someone has been adding diphenhydramine and doxylamine to that regimen, we're looking at serious drug interactions. These substances can cause paradoxical reactions in children. Instead of sedation, they can cause agitation, confusion, emotional distress. Combined with his anxiety medication," she paused, her expression grave. "It's likely that Daniel's evening deterioration was entirely iatrogenic, caused by the treatment itself. So you're saying my son has been suffering for weeks because that woman was poisoning him?" Marcus's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm saying we need to adjust his medications immediately and monitor him closely." Dr. Morrison stood. "I'd like to stay for this evening's medication routine, minus the unlabeled substance, and observe his response. Elena, would you be willing to stay as well, since you're the one who's actually been watching him consistently?" Elena looked at Marcus and Victoria, expecting objection, but Victoria nodded, her perfect composure cracking. please. If you can help us understand what's been happening to our son." So Elena stayed. She finished her cleaning while Dr. Morrison examined Daniel, asking him simple questions he didn't answer, observing his behaviors and taking notes. At 6:45, the doctor prepared Daniel's actual prescribed medications, just the 3 pills, properly dosed, crushed into applesauce. Elena stood in the doorway watching. Daniel ate the medication without resistance, the same blank obedience he always showed. Then he returned to his cartoons. They waited. 7 p.m. passed. 7:15, 7:30, Daniel didn't cry, he didn't rock. He didn't bang his head or retreat into distress stimming. He simply existed. Calm, unreachable, yes, still locked in his private world, but not suffering. At 8 o'clock, he allowed Victoria to lead him to his bedroom for his nighttime routine. No resistance, no tears. He climbed into bed, clutched his elephant, and closed his eyes. In the living room, Dr. Morrison turned to Marcus and Victoria. "I can't make a definitive diagnosis from one evening, but I think Elena may have identified the primary source of Daniel's recent deterioration. The question now is what else we might be missing. I'd like to reevaluate his entire medication protocol, possibly reduce dosages or eliminate medications that might not be necessary." "Whatever it takes," Marcus said immediately. Dr. Morrison nodded, then looked at Elena. "Miss Martinez, I have to say, many trained professionals have worked with Daniel and missed what you caught. That's remarkable." Elena felt heat rise in her face. I clean the same way every time, same routine, so I notice when things change, when patterns shift." She struggled to find words for something she'd never had to explain before. "Rich people don't notice the help, so we see things other people miss." The bluntness of it made Victoria flinch, but Dr. Morrison smiled slightly. "Observation without intervention is a powerful diagnostic tool. Maybe more powerful than we give it credit for." She began packing her medical bag. "I'll be back tomorrow evening, same time. Let's see if we can establish a new baseline for Daniel's behavior." After the doctor left, Marcus walked Elena to the service entrance, a first. She gathered her cart, exhausted and overwhelmed by the evening's events. "Elena," Marcus said as she was leaving, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my son from—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Just doing my job, sir," Elena said quietly. "No," his voice was firm. "You did much more than your job. You spoke up when it could have cost you everything. That takes courage I'm not sure I have." Elena didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded and pushed her cart toward the elevator, leaving Marcus Chen standing in his penthouse doorway, possibly thinking about invisibility and class and all the things money couldn't buy. That night, Elena couldn't sleep again, but this time it was different. This time she'd done something, spoken up. Maybe it made a difference. She checked her phone, scrolling through news she usually ignored. Then she saw it, a text from Sophia. "Mama, there's an article about the Chens, about their nanny. Did you know about this?" Elena clicked the link Sophia had sent, a local news story published 2 hours ago. Tech mogul's nanny arrested for child endangerment. The article was brief. Jessica Brennan, 26, had been taken into police custody for questioning after allegations that she'd been administering unauthorized substances to a child in her care. The investigation was ongoing. No charges had been filed yet, but authorities were interviewing the family and medical professionals. Elena stared at the article. This was real. She'd triggered something that couldn't be taken back. Jessica would face consequences, the story would spread, and Elena's name, she checked the article again, relieved, wasn't mentioned. The family had been described only as prominent Seattle residents. Her phone rang. Marcus Chen's number, which she only had because it was in the cleaning service's contact list. "Elena, I'm sorry to call so late. I wanted you to hear it from me before you saw the news. We filed a police report. Jessica has been arrested. There's going to be an investigation into what she was doing, why she was doing it. You'll probably be asked to give a statement." Elena's stomach clenched. "A statement to the police? You're a witness. Maybe the only one who actually saw what was happening. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you took a cleaning job, but we'll support you." Legal representation if you need it. Whatever you need. I don't understand why, Elena said, voicing the question that had been nagging at her all evening. Why would Jessica do this? What did she gain? Marcus was quiet for a moment. The police found her background isn't what she claimed. The credentials were real, but there are gaps. Previous families who said she was too intense with their children. Nothing provable, nothing actionable, but patterns. Dr. Morrison thinks some people are drawn to caretaking roles for the wrong reasons. Control, attention, some kind of psychological need to create dependency or crisis. Munchausen by proxy, though Marcus didn't use the term. Making people sick to position yourself as their caretaker, their savior. Elena felt sick. That little boy is going to be okay, Marcus said firmly. Thanks to you, get some sleep, Elena. We'll talk more tomorrow. The next 48 hours passed in a blur. Elena gave her statement to a detective who treated her with more respect than she'd expected, taking her observations seriously, asking detailed questions about what she'd seen and when. The detective explained that Jessica was being investigated for multiple counts of child endangerment and administering harmful substances to a minor. If convicted, she faced significant prison time. Meanwhile, Dr. Morrison had begun Daniel's medication re-evaluation. Wednesday evening, Elena arrived at the Chen penthouse to find the doctor already there, observing Daniel with his mother. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Daniel seemed more present, still not speaking, still locked in his private world, but the edge of distress that had always surrounded him had softened. We've cut his anxiety medication by half, Dr. Morrison told Elena, apparently considering her part of the care team now. And we're monitoring closely for withdrawal effects, but initial signs are promising. I think he was over-medicated from the start, and Jessica's additions pushed him into crisis. Thursday evening was even better. Daniel ate dinner without resistance. He allowed Victoria to read him a bedtime story. He didn't engage with it, but he didn't flee either. And when 7:30 rolled around, the time when he usually began his evening deterioration, he simply continued playing with his toy cars, arranging them in precise lines, calm and focused. Victoria cried. Elena witnessed it from the kitchen, where she was wiping down counters. Victoria stood in the doorway of Daniel's playroom, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, watching her son exist without suffering. Friday brought a new development. Marcus called Elena before her shift. I need to ask you something, and you can absolutely say no. Dr. Morrison suggested that Daniel might benefit from consistency right now, familiar routines, familiar people. The nanny agency is sending candidates, but in the meantime, would you be willing to adjust your schedule? Come during the day, be present during his routines. We'd pay you triple your normal rate, and you wouldn't have to clean. Just be there the way you've been there all along. Elena stood in her apartment, phone pressed to her ear, trying to process this. You want me to be his nanny? Not permanently, just until we find the right person. Someone we actually trust this time. Marcus's voice was strained. Daniel has been through so much. The one constant in all of this, the one person who noticed he was in trouble and did something about it, was you. Elena thought about Sophia's tuition, about the bills piled on her kitchen table, about what triple her normal rate would mean. But she also thought about Daniel, about the way he'd calmed that one night when she'd hummed, about how he sometimes drifted closer when she worked, not interacting but observing, finding something safe in her predictable routines. I'll do it, she said, but I don't know anything about autism therapy. I'm not a professional. You're observant and you're honest, Marcus said. Right now, that's more valuable than any credentials. So Elena became Daniel's temporary caretaker. She arrived Monday morning, nervous and uncertain, still wearing her cleaning uniform because she didn't own anything else appropriate. Victoria walked her through the daily schedule, the routines, the things Daniel needed. Most importantly, Victoria said, her eyes intense, if you notice anything that doesn't seem right, anything that concerns you, you tell us immediately. No more silence. No more dismissing the help. The words were an apology and a promise. Elena's first day was simultaneously terrifying and surprisingly natural. She didn't try to engage Daniel the way the previous nannies had. She didn't fill his space with words or activities or therapeutic interventions. Instead, she simply existed in his environment, predictable and calm. She prepared his breakfast the exact way he liked it, plain pasta with butter, always in the white bowl, fork placed at exactly 3 o'clock. She put on his cartoons at the exact time he expected. She moved through the apartment in the same pattern she'd used for 8 months of cleaning, and Daniel noticed. He didn't interact with her, didn't make eye contact or speak. But he stopped tensing when she entered the rooms. His meltdowns, which had been daily occurrences, didn't happen. He ate his meals. He slept through the night, small victories that felt enormous. On Tuesday, Elena was sitting on the floor, her knees protesting after years of cleaning work, organizing Daniel's toy cars. He preferred them in very specific arrangements, and she'd learned his system through observation. As she worked, she began humming, the same simple tune she'd hummed that night when he'd been in crisis. 4 notes, repetitive, predictable. Daniel's hands, which had been arranging blocks, paused. He turned his head slightly, not toward her, but toward the sound. Elena kept humming, her hands continuing their work with the cars. She didn't look at Daniel, didn't draw attention to the moment. Just continued the melody, steady and calm. After 2 minutes, Daniel stood up. He walked across the room, not to Elena, but to the shelf where his stuffed elephant sat. He picked up the elephant, clutched it to his chest, and returned to his blocks. But this time, he positioned himself 3 feet closer to where Elena was working. It was progress, tiny, barely measurable, but real. That evening, when Marcus came home, Elena reported the moment. She'd started keeping notes the way Dr. Morrison had suggested, times, behaviors, responses. Marcus read her simple, handwritten observations with intense focus. "He moved closer to you," Marcus said, wondering in his voice. He doesn't move toward people, ever. Maybe because I'm not trying to make him," Elena suggested. "I'm just there, predictable. Like furniture." Marcus looked up from the notes. "You're not furniture, Elena. You're the first person in 3 years who's reached my son." The police investigation into Jessica Brennan moved forward. Elena was called to give another statement, this time with more details about the timeline, about what she'd observed. The detective told her that Jessica's apartment had been searched, revealing stockpiles of medications, over-the-counter antihistamines, supplements, prescription drugs from previous employers. A journal documenting her treatment plans for various children she'd cared for, filled with disturbing notes about creating behavioral problems and then solving them. "She's done this before," the detective said, his expression grim. "Other families, other children, but yours is the first case with enough evidence for prosecution. You might have prevented her from doing this again." Elena felt sick thinking about the other children, the other families who'd hired Jessica thinking they were getting help. How many had blamed themselves, their parenting, their children's conditions, never knowing they'd invited a predator into their homes. By the end of the 2nd week, Marcus and Victoria offered Elena a permanent position. Not as a nanny, they were interviewing extensively, checking references, being far more careful this time, but as what they called a family care coordinator. Higher pay than her cleaning work, benefits, flexibility to keep Sophia in school. "You understand, Daniel, in a way we don't," Victoria admitted, something breaking in her perfectly maintained voice. "You understand what it means to observe without imposing, to be present without demanding. We need that." "He needs that," Elena accepted, though part of her felt like she was crossing a threshold she couldn't uncross. She was no longer invisible, no longer just the cleaning lady who nobody noticed, and honestly, it was terrifying. 3 weeks after Jessica's arrest, Daniel had his appointment with Dr. Morrison for a full re-evaluation. Elena accompanied the family, her role having shifted from invisible worker to essential member of Daniel's care team. She sat in the waiting room while the doctor conducted tests, feeling desperately out of place among the other families with their obvious wealth and education. When Dr. Morrison called them back into her office, her expression was cautiously optimistic. "Daniel is showing significant improvement. His anxiety levels have decreased measurably since we adjusted his medications and removed the toxic additions. He's sleeping better, eating better, and most significantly, his behavioral patterns have stabilized. But he's still not talking, Victoria said, her hope and disappointment warring in her voice. No, Dr. Morrison agreed, but I want to be clear, Daniel's autism isn't something we're trying to cure. It's how his brain is wired, and that's not inherently bad. What we've addressed is the crisis state he was in, the suffering caused by improper treatment. Now we can actually begin appropriate support. She turned to Elena. I want to ask you something. What do you do when you're with Daniel? Specifically, Elena felt heat rise in her face. All these educated people staring at her, expecting expertise she didn't have. I just try to be predictable. I do the same things at the same time. I don't try to make him do anything he doesn't want to do. I hum sometimes when he seems stressed. The same tune always. She paused, uncertain. I treat him like he's intelligent even if he can't speak. Like his preferences matter. Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. You're providing what we call a regulated environment. Predictable, non-demanding, respectful of his autonomy. That's exactly what trauma-informed autism support looks like. You've been doing therapeutic work without realizing it. Elena blinked. I just thought, he's a person. People deserve respect. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. How many professionals had forgotten that basic truth while implementing their specialized techniques and structured interventions? Over the following weeks, Daniel continued to improve. The daily meltdowns didn't return. His sleep normalized. He began to eat a wider variety of foods, still limited, still very particular, but progressing. And his awareness of his environment increased. He noticed when routines changed. He noticed when Elena wore different shoes. He noticed when his father came home early. He didn't communicate these observations verbally, but his behavior showed his awareness. A small shift in posture when Marcus walked in. A slightly longer glance at Elena's new sneakers, moments of presence that hadn't existed before. 4 weeks after Jessica's arrest, on a Monday afternoon in early December, Elena was sitting on the floor organizing Daniel's cars. She'd developed a routine with them. She would arrange them in one pattern, then leave them for Daniel to rearrange however he preferred. It was a quiet kind of interaction, non-demanding, accepting. She was humming her 4-note melody, the one she always used when Daniel did something unprecedented. He hummed back, not perfectly, not all 4 notes. Just 2 notes repeated softly, almost experimentally, but he was echoing her, engaging with her sound. Elena's hands are still on the toy cars, her heart hammered. This was the first intentional communication she'd witnessed from Daniel in the entire time she'd known him. The first indication that he was not just tolerating her presence, but actually participating in their shared space. She kept humming, slow and steady. Daniel continued his 2-note response. They created a simple melody together, her 4 notes, his 2 back and forth. Not conversation, but communication, connection. When Victoria came home an hour later, Elena was crying. Happy tears, overwhelmed tears, tears for this small boy who was finally, slowly, showing that he wanted to reach back toward the world. He hummed with me, Elena told Victoria, her voice breaking. He responded. He got engaged. Victoria's perfect composure shattered. She sank onto the floor beside Elena, tears streaming down her face, and watched her son arrange toy cars, humming softly to himself. The sound of a child who was finding his way back. Jessica Brennan's trial didn't happen quickly. The legal system moved at its own pace, but her arraignment made the local news. Former nanny charged with multiple counts of child endangerment. The story detailed her pattern of behavior, the families she'd worked for, the children she'd harmed while positioning herself as their savior. Other families came forward, adding their testimonies. The scope of what she'd done expanded with each new revelation. Elena was subpoenaed to testify at the preliminary hearing. She'd never been in a courtroom before, never worn the business casual outfit that Victoria had helped her buy for the occasion. She sat in the witness box, hands folded in her lap, and answered the prosecutor's questions with the same quiet observation that had first alerted her to the problem. You noticed a pattern in Daniel's behavior. Can you describe what you observed? He was fine during the day, but after his evening medication, within 30 minutes, he would become distressed, crying, rocking, sometimes hitting himself. It happened every time I worked, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, like clockwork. And when you observed Jessica Brennan administering Daniel's medication, what did you see? She was adding something from an unlabeled bottle. Not the prescribed medications, something else. Did you know what that substance was? No, ma'am, but I knew it wasn't part of what the doctors had prescribed. The defense attorney tried to make Elena seem unreliable, just a cleaning woman, no medical training, no expertise. How could she possibly know what was happening? But the prosecutor had a response ready. Miss Martinez may not have a medical degree, but she has something many professionals lack, the ability to observe without bias. She had no agenda except protecting a child she saw suffering. And her observations were correct. The evidence proves that. Jessica was eventually convicted on multiple counts. The sentencing phase revealed disturbing details about her psychology, a desperate need for control, for being seen as indispensable, for creating crises she could then solve. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in prison, calling her actions a profound betrayal of the most vulnerable. Elena attended the sentencing, sitting in the back row with Marcus and Victoria. When it was over, when Jessica was led away in handcuffs, Marcus turned to Elena. "Thank you," he said simply, "for seeing, for speaking, for saving our son." Elena nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Life moved forward. The new nanny they eventually hired was older, extensively vetted, and respectful of Elena's insights. Her name was Margaret, a grandmother with 30 years of experience who understood that reaching Daniel required patience, not force. She and Elena developed a partnership, combining Margaret's professional knowledge with Elena's understanding of Daniel's specific patterns. Daniel continued to improve, though his progress was measured in small increments rather than dramatic leaps. He began to tolerate touch, brief, pressure-based hugs rather than gentle ones. He started using picture cards to indicate his needs, a communication system that Margaret introduced and Daniel slowly accepted. He hummed more often, sometimes full melodies, sometimes just fragments. He didn't speak. Might never speak, Dr. Morrison cautioned, but he was no longer suffering, no longer locked in crisis, and that was victory enough. 6 months after Jessica's arrest, on a spring evening when cherry blossoms were starting to bloom across Seattle, Daniel did something that made everyone stop and stare. Elena was leaving for the day, gathering her things. Daniel was in the living room with Margaret, working on a puzzle. Marcus and Victoria were in the kitchen, discussing dinner plans. Normal, calm, routine. As Elena walked toward the service entrance, though she'd been told a dozen times she could use the front door now, the habit was hard to break. She heard a sound. "Elena," she turned. Everyone turned. The word was quiet, slurred, slightly hesitant, but it was a word, a name, her name. Daniel stood in the doorway to the living room, his stuffed elephant clutched to his chest, his enormous brown eyes finally meeting hers directly. "Elena," he said again, stronger this time. Elena's vision blurred with tears. She knelt down, making herself small and non-threatening, and smiled at him. "Yes, baby, it's Elena, I'm here." Daniel didn't move toward her, didn't hug her or touch her, but he maintained eye contact for 3 full seconds, an eternity for him, before turning and walking back to his puzzle. Behind her, Elena heard Victoria's sob of joy, heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath, heard Margaret's soft, "Oh my God," Daniel had spoken. After 3 years of silence, after countless professionals and failed interventions, after trauma and crisis and finally healing, he had chosen to speak. And he had chosen to speak to the cleaning lady who had noticed when no one else would. The weeks following Daniel's first word were filled with careful optimism. Dr. Morrison cautioned against expecting a flood of language. Selective mutism and autism didn't work that way. But Daniel began to use words more frequently, usually single words, usually directed at specific people for specific needs. Water, elephant, no, cars, and often, Lena. Elena's role in the household had transformed completely. She was no longer the invisible cleaning lady, though she still sometimes caught herself pushing an imaginary cart, muscle memory from years of that work. Now she was Daniel's care coordinator, his advocate, the person who understood his routines and patterns better than anyone. Victoria had offered her office space in their home, but Elena preferred to work on the floor of the living room, surrounded by Daniel's toys, maintaining the approachable presence he'd grown comfortable with. She documented his progress, coordinated with his therapists, and managed his schedule, but mostly she just existed in his space, predictable and safe. Sophia had cried when Elena told her about the salary increase. "Mama, you can quit your other cleaning jobs. You can rest. Your knees." "My knees are fine," Elena had lied, but she did quit the office building job and the lawyer's condo. She kept her small studio apartment in Renton, though she could have afforded better now. Change, even good change, took time to accept. Marcus and Victoria's marriage, which had been strained under the weight of Daniel's crisis, began to mend. They started attending therapy themselves, processing the guilt and grief of having not seen what was happening to their son, of having dismissed the person who tried to tell them. "We thought money could solve everything," Victoria admitted to Elena one afternoon, the two of them watching Daniel play in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "We hired the best people, bought the best equipment, followed the best advice, but we didn't actually see our son. We saw a problem to be fixed." Elena didn't know how to respond to that level of vulnerability from someone who'd once been unable to remember her name. "You saw him," Victoria continued, "not as a problem or a project. As a person, that made all the difference." 7 months after the arrest, the Chen family was featured in a Seattle Times article about autism acceptance and the importance of listening to non-credentialed voices in care work. Elena had been reluctant to participate, but Marcus had convinced her. "People need to know," he'd said. "Other families need to know that sometimes the most important insights come from unexpected sources. That expertise isn't just about degrees and credentials." The article was fair and thoughtful. It discussed Daniel's journey without exploiting him, examined systemic issues in how wealthy families hired care workers, and highlighted Elena's role without making her a savior figure. It acknowledged that she'd done something simple but profound. She'd paid attention and spoken up. The responses were overwhelming. Other families reached out, sharing their own stories of children harmed by trusted caregivers. Autism advocacy groups contacted Elena, asking her to speak at conferences about observation-based care approaches. Universities inquired about her methods, wanting to understand what she'd done that trained professionals had missed. Elena found it all bewildering. She'd just been doing her job, she'd just been paying attention, but Dr. Morrison helped her understand. "What you did was radical precisely because it was so simple. You didn't impose theories or techniques. You observed, you respected, you responded. That's the foundation of all good care work, but it often gets lost under layers of professionalization. You reminded everyone what it actually looks like." 8 months after Jessica's arrest, Sophia graduated from community college with her nursing degree. The ceremony was held in a high school gymnasium, folding chairs and proud families, nothing like the Chen's world of wealth and prestige. But Marcus, Victoria, Daniel, and Margaret all attended. They sat in the back row, respectful of Elena's desire not to make a spectacle, but present, supporting the woman who had saved their family. When Sophia walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Daniel, sitting on Marcus's lap, his elephant tucked under his arm, said clearly, "Sophia, Lena's girl." It was the longest sentence he'd ever spoken. 6 words that represented years of silence finally breaking. Elena cried through the rest of the ceremony, overwhelmed by the impossible trajectory of last year, from invisible cleaning lady to essential family member, from dismissed observer to recognized expert, from barely scraping by to financial stability. But more than any of that, she'd helped a child. She'd seen suffering and done something about it, even when it was hard, even when it could have cost her everything. 1 year after Jessica Brennan's arrest, on a cool October evening that felt like a bookend to where everything had started. Elena sat in the Chen's living room watching Daniel play. He was 8 now, still autistic, still nonverbal most of the time, but no longer suffering, no longer locked in crisis. He'd learned to use a communication device, a tablet with picture symbols that he could tap to express needs and wants. He spoke more frequently now, short phrases usually, but his vocabulary was growing. He attended a specialized school that understood autism as a different way of being rather than a problem to be fixed. He was happy. As happy as any child, with good days and hard days, with preferences and dislikes, with a personality that was emerging more clearly as the trauma faded. Marcus and Victoria had become advocates themselves, working with autism organizations, funding research into trauma-informed care approaches, and most importantly, hiring and compensating care workers fairly, treating them as the professionals they were regardless of credentials. Victoria sat down beside Elena on the couch, watching Daniel arrange his toy cars in increasingly complex patterns. "I never thanked you properly," she said quietly, "for everything." "You've thanked me many times," Elena replied. "No, I mean," Victoria paused, struggling with words. "I never apologized for not seeing you, for dismissing you when you tried to tell me something was wrong, for treating you like you were invisible." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I was invisible. That's how people like you are trained to see people like me." It wasn't said with anger, just honesty. Victoria flinched but didn't look away. "I'm trying to do better," Victoria said. "We both are. Learning that wealth doesn't equal wisdom, that expertise comes in forms we weren't taught to recognize." "It's a start," Elena said gently. Daniel looked up from his cars, his eyes moving between the two women. Then he stood, walked over to Elena, and leaned against her leg, his version of a hug, pressure and proximity without overwhelming touch. "Lena is safe," he said clearly, 2 words that meant everything. Later that evening, after Elena had gone home to her apartment, a slightly larger one now, in a better neighborhood, shared with Sophia, who was working as a pediatric nurse, she sat on her small balcony and thought about the past year. She thought about all the families she'd cleaned for over the decades, the private moments she'd witnessed, the conversations she'd overheard, the patterns she'd observed, all while being invisible, unnoticed, dismissed as just the help. She thought about how many other problems might have been solved if someone had simply asked the people who were always present but never seen. The housekeepers and janitors and nannies and aides who moved through wealthy spaces, observing everything, noticed by no one. She thought about Daniel, about how close he'd come to being institutionalized, medicated into oblivion, labeled as unreachable when really he'd been crying out for help in the only way he could. And she thought about Jessica, about predators who exploited the fact that wealthy people didn't actually look at their care workers, didn't verify or observe or question as long as the surfaces stayed clean and the problems seemed managed. Elena's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Daniel asked for you. I want to know if you'll be here tomorrow for his birthday party." She smiled and typed back, "Of course. I won't miss it." Daniel's birthday party the next day was small, just family, Margaret, Dr. Morrison, and a few of Daniel's classmates from his specialized school. No overwhelming decorations or loud music, just cake and presents and the people he felt safe with. When it came time to blow out the candles, Daniel looked around at the gathered faces. Then he reached out and took Elena's hand, a gesture that still surprised everyone who witnessed it, touch being something Daniel rarely tolerated. "Lena, help," he said, his voice soft but certain. So Elena leaned down, and together they blew out the 8 candles on Daniel's birthday cake. The room erupted in gentle applause, careful not to overwhelm him, but celebrating this moment, a child who had been so lost, now found. A child who had been so alone, now connected. Later, as the party wound down and guests departed, Marcus pulled Elena aside. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "About how to make sure what happened to Daniel doesn't happen to other children. About how to value the observations of people like you." He explained his idea, a foundation that would train care workers in trauma-informed approaches, compensate them fairly, and create reporting systems where concerns could be raised without fear of dismissal or retaliation. A foundation that would advocate for seeing the people society trained us to look through. "I want you to help run it," Marcus said. "You'd be perfect. You understand both sides, the invisibility and the visibility, the observation and the action." Elena was quiet, processing. "I don't have credentials. I don't have a degree." "You have something better," Marcus replied. "You have wisdom that comes from actually paying attention, from seeing people as they are, not as theories or diagnoses or problems. That's what we need." 3 years later, the Elena Martinez Foundation had helped reform care worker practices in 17 states. It had trained thousands of housekeepers, nannies, and aides in basic observation skills and how to report concerns. It had investigated 12 cases of caregiver abuse, protecting vulnerable children and adults. And it had successfully lobbied for legislation requiring background checks and regular oversight of in-home care workers. Elena never became famous. She didn't want that, but she became effective. A quiet force for change, working behind the scenes the way she'd always worked, but now with resources and authority. Daniel, at 11 years old, was thriving in his own way. He would never be neurotypical, never be the child his parents had once imagined. But he was happy, communicative in his own fashion, and deeply loved. He still preferred toy cars and routines, still needed his elephant and his predictable patterns. But he also had friends now, interests, preferences that were respected rather than pathologized. And he had Elena, the cleaning lady who had refused to look away when everyone else did. On the 3-year anniversary of Jessica's arrest, Elena visited Daniel after school. He was in the living room of the Chen penthouse. Though the family had moved to a more accessible home, they'd kept this place for Marcus's work. Daniel was arranging cars, his movements precise and satisfied. "Lena," he said when she entered, his face lighting up in the small, subtle way that meant joy for him. "Hi, baby," Elena replied, sitting on the floor beside him, her knees protesting less these days thanks to better healthcare and physical therapy. Daniel continued his car arrangement, comfortable in the silence. Then, after several minutes, he said something he'd never said before. "Lena saved me." Elena's throat tightened. "No, honey, you saved yourself. You survived until we could help." Daniel considered this, his brilliant mind processing in ways that still amazed everyone around him. Then he looked at her directly, sustaining eye contact in a way he rarely managed. "Lena saw me," he corrected. "That's saving. And maybe it was. Maybe being seen, really seen, as a full person deserving of attention and respect was the most fundamental form of rescue there was." 5 years after that October evening, when everything changed, Elena Martinez stood on a stage at a National Care Workers Conference. She wore a simple blue dress that Sophia had helped her pick out, her grey-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. The auditorium was filled with hundreds of people, housekeepers, nannies, home health aides, janitors. People who spent their days in other people's spaces, invisible and essential. "I was a cleaning lady for 25 years, Elena said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I scrubbed floors and cleaned toilets and dusted shelves. And I was invisible. People walked past me without seeing me, talked over me like I wasn't there, made decisions without asking my input. That invisibility was painful sometimes. But it also gave me something valuable, perspective." She told Daniel's story with his family's permission, not all the details, but enough. A child who was suffering, professionals who were failing, a woman who noticed because she was trained to observe without interfering. "I'm not here to tell you that being invisible is good," Elena continued. "It's not. We deserve to be seen, to be valued, to be compensated fairly for the essential work we do. But I am here to tell you that your observations matter. What you notice, the patterns, the changes, the small details that other people miss, that has value, that can save lives." The audience was silent, attentive. Elena could see herself reflected in their faces, people who understood what it meant to be present but unseen, essential but dismissed. If you notice something wrong, if you see someone suffering, especially a child or vulnerable adult, speak up. I know it's scary. I know it can cost you your job, your income, your stability, but there are resources now, protections, organizations that will support you, and more than that, there's the moral weight of knowing you tried, of knowing you saw someone and refused to look away. She finished her speech to standing applause, uncomfortable with the attention, but grateful for the message reaching people who needed to hear it. After the conference, she returned to Seattle, to her work with the foundation, to her small but comfortable life. Sophia was thriving as a pediatric nurse, getting married next spring to a kind man who worked as a teacher. Elena had become a grandmother figure to several of Sophia's friends' children, always present at birthday parties and graduations. And she remained part of Daniel's life, though less centrally now. He was 13, attending a specialized school that understood his needs, developing into a teenager with opinions and interests and a wry sense of humor that surprised everyone. He used his communication device fluently, spoke when he felt comfortable, and had a particular genius for mathematics that his teachers were helping him explore. On a spring evening much like the one when she'd first walked into the Chen penthouse 6 years ago, Elena visited for dinner. It had become a monthly tradition. She would come, they would eat together, Daniel would show her his latest projects, and they would exist in the comfortable silence of people who had survived something difficult together. After dinner, Daniel asked to speak with Elena privately. This was new. He rarely initiated conversations, rarely asked for one-on-one time. She followed him to his room, curiosity and slight concern mixing in her chest. Daniel sat on his bed, his old elephant beside him, worn and loved. He typed on his communication device, the words appearing on the screen as he selected them. I'm writing a paper for school about autism, about how society sees us. That's wonderful, Elena said, settling into the chair by his desk. I want to write about you, Daniel continued, his fingers moving deliberately across the device. About how you saw me differently. Not as broken, just as stuck. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. I'd be honored, Daniel typed more. Teacher says everyone has a person who changes their life. You're mine. The person who saw me when I couldn't show myself. Daniel, Elena said softly, you changed my life too. You taught me that speaking up matters, even when you're scared. Especially when you're scared. Daniel smiled, a real smile, something he'd learned to do in the years since his crisis. We saved each other, he typed, and maybe that was the truest statement of all. Years from now, when people would ask Elena Martinez about her life, about her journey from invisible cleaning lady to nationally recognized advocate, she would always return to the same moment. Not the moment of triumph, not the foundation's success, not the awards or recognition. She would return to that October evening, standing in the doorway of a 7-year-old boy's room, humming a simple 4-note melody, and watching him slowly, incrementally, find his way back from crisis. She would remember the way his small hands had stilled, the way his rocking had slowed, the way he'd reached for his elephant with trembling fingers. She would remember thinking, I am just a cleaning lady. Who am I to intervene? And then deciding, I am someone who sees, and that has to be enough, because sometimes the most important voices are the ones we've been trained to ignore. Sometimes the greatest expertise comes not from credentials or training, but from simple, sustained attention, from refusing to look away. Sometimes salvation comes not from the people with impressive titles and expensive services, but from the person pushing a squeaky cart through marble hallways, invisible to everyone except the one person who needed to be seen. Elena Martinez had been that person, the one who noticed, the one who spoke up, the one who refused to accept that a child's suffering was inevitable or unsolvable. She had been the silent observer who found her voice. And in finding her voice, she had given a voiceless child his own. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.